please ask me, what is the best podcast currently to learn about health and fitness principles ranging from muscle hypertrophy to gut health, to biomechanics, to food intolerances, all the way to self-improvement and happiness? Well, thank you, because I believe at this point in time it is Sigma Nutrition Radio on sigmanutrition.com. Because here's the deal. If you want to learn about health and fitness related topics or any topics, you have to make sure that your source of information is provided by someone who fulfills the following criteria. The person must be A, open-minded, B, facilitate critical thinking, C, the information must not be biased by financial or other interests, and finally, the person must be willing to change his or her mind when better information comes out. Based on this criteria, I'm proudly presenting to you Danny Lennon from sigmanutrition.com. He has a master's degree in nutritional science, and now he has published close to 150 episodes on Sigma Nutrition Radio. He interacts with the best of the best people in the fitness industry. Eric Helms, Lyle McDonald, Brett Schoenfeld, James Krieger, Mike Israetel, Greg Nuckols, Menno Henselmans, Alberto Nunez, Jacob Wilson, John Berardi, Ben Escrow, and Ryan Doris, just to name a few. Also check out the show notes underneath this video where I'll be linking to my personal favorite episodes on Sigma Nutrition Radio. But all that aside, what did we talk about on this episode? Well, wouldn't you be curious what someone like he has to say about running a successful podcast or becoming successful in the fitness industry in general? Or what he, after corresponding with hundreds of the best field experts, has to say on topics like gluten sensitivity or protein timing and dosing, or whether calorie tracking is even necessary to get ripped? Well, there you go. We talked about all of that stuff. And of course, he didn't get away without me asking about some questions about happiness and living a balanced and rich life. So as usual, lots of cool topics here. And let's just get to the interview straight away. And by the way, because the internet connection was pretty shit, we'll get straight away to Danny's responses, and I'll be introducing the questions from here. So, the first topic I asked him about is what he believes to be the key to a successful fitness podcast.
Two words that you mentioned there are probably part of that, of being open-minded and critical. We preach that a lot with our advice on nutrition and training, of being able to continue to learn and not having a narrow-minded focus on a certain thing, and being able to constantly evolve and learn more. And I think on the business side of things, for me, that was the exact same thing, of not going in presuming that I knew everything, or presuming what people wanted, or presuming what I wanted to put out was the best way to go. And really not only just trying to provide the best piece of content, but realizing that I had to continue learning over time, and stuff that I would put out, I might change my view on, and be okay to say to people, look, stuff I said before, I actually maybe don't agree with anymore, based on what I've learned now, and here's our new position on it. But then also from a business point of view, it's learning that the people that are interacting with the material and listening to podcasts regularly, what is it they're specifically getting value from? What are they really enjoying? What do they actually want to see in the future? And trying to do that. And it's not a case of like, I've every answer right now and I've nailed everything. It's something I'm continuing to try to do, but just having that awareness that there's a really strong core group of people that now follow Sigma Nutrition, that enjoy the content, that are regularly interact with it, and it's just trying to provide them with the best service that we can. And so just constantly trying to listen and be open-minded, and being willing to, I suppose, pivot and change and go into what direction is needed.
So be open-minded, think critically, and always seek to improve. But what was something that was surprising to him as he got into podcasting, and what most people will likely recognize as they get into podcasting?
I think one thing for podcasters in particular that they learn quite early, or really anyone online, when you start trying to interact with people that initially you might see as high profile or these big experts that you really look up to, is that when you actually do start interacting with them like a normal human and start talking to them and contacting them and reaching out and asking for help or asking for their thoughts on things, 9 times out of 10, people are really good to try and help other people. They're really good to want to discuss what they want to do. And I mean, it makes sense when we logically think of it, right? We have people who are in the fitness industry, and yeah, they might have a big name and a big reputation, but they're there because they're interested in a certain thing that you're also interested in. So if you're curious enough to ask them some kind of cool questions, or to start conversations, or even just to drop them a message to say, I really enjoy what you're doing, thank you so much, people respond really well to that. And so when I started contacting people and interacting with them and getting to know these people online, at first it is kind of surprising about just how cool people are with that. And there's, I suppose, this false idea in our head maybe that people won't want to talk to us because we're nobody. And then in the beginning, you just see that everyone's kind of the same, and it just develops. And if you go into it with the idea that you want to just learn something from them, or just that you're not going in to try and get something from them, then that's where you can kind of become friends with other people in that field, and it just expands from there. Whereas where it doesn't really work is when you go in always trying to think of how I can get something from this interaction. People can see through that straight away. So for me, it's just been getting to know people and actually just becoming friends with people because they're doing cool stuff, and me just acknowledging that they're doing cool things.
So there you go. If you want to start a podcast, be prepared for a positive surprise. These amazing people that we interview are super, super helpful. How do you think I could interview someone like Eric Helms or Dr. Dominic D'Agostino? Well, I reached out to them, and bam, they are happy to help. Because even though they are super successful, 9 times out of 10, they are super helpful, genuinely nice people. Okay, but how do we even find guests for our podcast?
People probably would have seen over the past year that a lot of the names that were on might not have been big names in the mainstream perhaps, but were real heavyweights when it came to actual academic research. So people that were going to conferences would know these people as like the real big names in certain areas of research. But outside of that, no one on the internet is going to know who certain people are. And so to get those types of people mainly came out of my own reading of looking at certain areas in research, coming across who were the kind of main authors in the area, reading their stuff, and actually reaching out and maybe asking them a question about a certain study, or asking them about certain kind of conclusions they came to, just to advance my own knowledge. And once you reach out to people that way, then a kind of a progression from there of like, would you be interested in coming on to discuss this stuff? And so for me, a lot of it has came from my own kind of research on trying to look at different areas, and then who is putting out good information in that area, or who is doing primary research in that area. And then the rest is just people that I see doing good work, and that could be from someone that I know is putting out good content on their site, or is writing really good articles, or has maybe perhaps published a number of books or peer-reviewed papers that I've really enjoyed. So really it's just become a natural thing for me of just like, who am I most interested in at the moment, what topics am I looking at, and who in that area is putting out evidence-based information. And so yeah, that's how it's going to progress recently, at least.
Yep. And additionally, if you want to find good guests for your podcast, it's a good strategy to browse through the guest list of frequently published podcasters, such as Danny or people like Beth Coomer. But here's the tough thing though. Hypothetical situation. If you invite someone on your podcast who will say something that you will disagree with, how do you deal with it? You want to facilitate goodwill with your guest, but on the other hand, you want to make sure that your audience goes away with the right conclusions. Let's see.
It's a hard line to toe, and maybe I haven't got it right all the time, or maybe people would agree that or disagree that I've done it right all the time, but I've at least tried to be consistent in the way I approach it. And as I've said to people before, the way I look at it is, for each guest that comes on, there are going to be different guests that may be saying different variations to another person, or have a slightly different view on someone, or maybe even a radically different view. But in general, there's going to be even slight variations on people that maybe agree with 90 to 95% of the research. If there's a 5% discrepancy, yeah, there's going to be difference of opinions. And that includes maybe what I believe as well. But my job at any one time, I think at least initially when I bring someone on, is not immediately to, as soon as they say something, to try and say you're wrong, or me to get in a debate. It's more of, can I give this person, so for example, you mentioned Donald Lehman, someone who's been at the top end of research for so many years and has achieved so much and has like just this amazing CV you look at, is to give a platform to allow him to express not only what research he's done, what they found, what they took from that, and then what his group has concluded. And that's the main thing. And then from there, people listening can have the critical thinking skills to be able to take from that what they think will fit into the way they're going to use it, as opposed to me always trying to say, well, this part that he said was right, but the other part is wrong, so ignore it and just do it the way that Danny Lennon says. That's not what I want to try and do with it. It's like, here's people that are involved in research. Here's what they're finding, what they're concluding. Now, here's some stuff you can do. Now, I obviously don't want it to be just a free-for-all where people can say everything. So there's been instances where people have said certain things on the podcast that I disagreed quite strongly with. And so I would sometimes do a follow-up podcast. So I've done solo podcasts previously where I do a follow-up to explain my stance on certain topics where it differed from that. I think particularly like episodes 84 and 85 is an example of that, if people want to check that out, where I've kind of laid out where I differed from it and trying to give my stance. And I think from this point on, there's going to be a lot more frequent solo podcasts on my end to try and give people more of an understanding of where I stand on a lot of these things, as opposed to always conflating what a guest says with exactly what I believe. And yeah, maybe at times I haven't been, not confrontational enough, but maybe have not directly head on addressed certain things that were said. So that's something that, again, I can try and work on. But in general, that's the way I approach it, of giving these people a platform to say what they say. And if I need to disagree with something, I will try and either bring that up at a different time, or at least maybe bring it up at some stage, hopefully in the podcast as well.
So yeah, be willing to put out what you believe, and don't get frightened from big names. They disagree with other people too. Lane Norton talks about it all the time. There are disagreements. Actually, let's get a good friend's view on this. Eric, how do you think we can disagree with each other respectfully?
Probably the most important thing that I hope everyone gets out of this is that you can have disagreements in a respectful way that actually improve everyone's knowledge and understanding of something. For just a brief bit of background, most recently, Menno and I had like a 1 week long debate on protein, and now we are on the same side of the table. And only a year ago, Peter and I were co-authors on evidence-based recommendations to natural bodybuilding, and only 3 weeks from now, I'll be presenting in Australia with Lane. So I hope everyone understands from that we don't necessarily have to be at each other's throats when there's disagreements, and that this can be something very productive.
There you go. So how does a good fitness authority change his or her mind about something that initially they might have believed in, but now they don't believe anymore that it's true? How do you come out with your new opinion?
If you haven't changed your mind on anything, say in the last 5 years, then you're probably not progressing your ideas, because a lot has changed within that time, or at least you came across new and better information. And so, I mean, that's one of the most important things to me, to from time to time be able to look back and say, look, I was wrong about this. I got this wrong, but I didn't have access to the information I now have. I've came across better quality evidence based on this new information that I've learned, and new evidence that someone has shown me or that I've been able to find. Now my opinion is this, because that's all we can do, right? We can only base our current opinion on what our current level of understanding of the evidence is. A number of years ago, I would have been really harsh, completely overly harsh on gluten, for example, or feeling that gluten was perhaps an issue for a larger percentage of the population than I currently believe it is. And last year, I ended up writing a 4-part series, quite in depth on this. I think it's just saying that it's only an issue for people with celiac disease, for example, is not really correct, in that I think other people can have issues too. But at the other end or the other extreme, saying that everyone should be on a gluten-free diet, or that most people have a problem with gluten, is also incorrect based on what we currently know. So gluten is one kind of classic example, but there's been a ton of other things. How much, say, processed food can be included in the diet. Years gone by, I would have been a lot more harsh in trying to keep as much of, like, nearly all the diet from whole foods. And that's not necessarily an unhealthy thing, but maybe not completely necessary. And then other things like, say, even fish oil supplementation. A number of years ago, maybe under the assumption that because there can be some benefits, say, for inflammation, that for those people who are more likely to have that, or in a more kind of metabolically stressed state, going super high dose could be a good idea. Whereas that seems like to be counterproductive now, I think, and is probably not a good idea. And so keeping it to a much more moderate dose of maybe like a few grams is probably a better way. So there are a number of examples, but I could probably go on all day about the stuff that I previously had wrong. But like I say, it's a good thing that to be able to see that progression and to be able to just say, look, this stuff was wrong. I came across better evidence, and now this is where we are.
Perfect. So let's see what Danny, as someone who's talked to people like Mike Israetel or Eric Helms or Dr. Donald Lehman, thinks about protein dosing and timing.
Based on what we've kind of currently seen, at least in people who are doing maybe resistance training or athletes, it seems that somewhere around 4 meals per day of a protein dose that surpasses, say, about somewhere between 20 to 40 grams usually of protein, of a high quality protein. And really that is more correlated to how much leucine is in that protein. So we want to have approximately about 4 meals. Now, we could make the case that you could maybe get it with 3, maybe 5 might give a bit more. We're not really too sure, but it seems that at the moment, at least 4 is probably a kind of decent guiding number of 4 of those meals that surpass what we call the leucine threshold. So to maximize that muscle protein synthetic response, we need to reach a certain amount of leucine to trigger that. And it seems to be somewhere between like 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine. And so we need a bolus dose of protein at each of those meals that has a leucine content that gets to that threshold. And then in theory, that maximizes the muscle protein synthetic response. And so therefore, in theory, is going to support muscle repair, muscle recovery, and muscle growth to the greatest degree. And so when it comes to a practical application with people, it seems to be somewhere of like 1.5 grams up as far as maybe even 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight as a daily intake of protein. And so for me right now, it's like, get your daily protein within that range, try and distribute it across in 3 to 4 meals with, and you can go more if you want, but at least 3 to 4 of those meals having a leucine dose that's above, say, 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine. And that would probably take care of like 99.9% of people that are, say, just trying to lift weights and keep hold of as much muscle mass as possible.
Okay, so 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kilogram of protein per day, with 3 to 5 meals of at least 20 to 40 grams of protein, with 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per each meal. And while on the topic of macros, Danny just finished a great article series on the optimal calorie deficit. Should you always go nice and slow? Because lots of smart people like Lane Norton have argued that for years. On the other hand, there might be a rationale for going more aggressive. Let's see the response.
There's so much different aspects to this. People talk about when you're in a cutting phase, we want it to be nice and slow and sustainable and manageable and go for a very low rate of weight loss. So gradually taking it over time, with the idea that the slower you take it and the smaller the deficit, it's number 1, more manageable for the person. Number 2, it's easier to stick to. And then number 3, that you'll retain more lean body mass. You can set up a diet in a way that you can have quite a large calorie deficit and that someone's dropping weight quite rapidly in a way that the majority of that's still going to be fat mass and they don't really lose any muscle mass. In some cases, I mentioned some recent work by, say, Stu Phillips's lab that actually had people in a 40% calorie deficit doing a pretty tough resistance training program, and they actually gained some lean body mass over the course of the study despite being in a 40% calorie deficit. Now there were some kind of caveats to that in terms of how detrained they were, et cetera, but we're seeing that it's possible, right? And we know that people, when they're in a cutting phase and a dieting phase, can not only preserve but can maybe even gain muscle mass. So it's trying to get rid of some of that misconception that a large deficit always means lean body mass. It doesn't, particularly if you have a sufficiently stimulating training stimulus, and then you also have sufficient protein intake, and then distribute it like we just previously mentioned. So if you get those things right, you can definitely preserve muscle whilst in a pretty large deficit. What it then does mean, it just means that you obviously can't run the diet for as long if you have a massive deficit and you're losing weight quicker. So to get to the end goal, it just shortens the duration of that diet. in theory, you could say that if it's nice and slow and you're able to eat more calories during the diet, it's easier to sustain. But then my counterpoint would be, what if now someone could just go on a more aggressive diet that maybe on an acute time, so on a day-to-day basis, maybe a bit harder, but now they're only dieting for 6 weeks instead of 12 weeks. So maybe that for certain personality types and certain people is easier to adhere to. Similarly, we could have a case of, if you think of the calorie deficit over the course of, say, a week, instead of just over a daily basis, now we can set up someone to have the same deficit over the course of a week, but instead of being in a slight deficit every single day, which some people just don't really enjoy because they can't eat as much as they want, but it's not really that big of a deficit, compared to what if we now have 2 to 3 of those days where we have a massive deficit, and then on the other days they don't even have to be in a deficit, they could be eating at maintenance. I've one of my buddies here that we've been doing some kind of stuff with his nutrition on a recent cutting phase, where all we really did was set him up where one day of the week he did like a 24-hour fast, and the other days of the week he was pretty much in and around the maintenance, and he was dropping body fat at that. So for his personality type, it was pretty easy to go through just one 24-hour fast, because he knew the other days of the weeks he wasn't technically dieting, because he could have in and around a maintenance intake. And so the idea of adherence and being able to stick to it really depends on the person's adherence. So it's not that aggressive dieting is always better, but it's also a case that it's not always worse.
Right, so it's all a matter of your goals, priorities, and personality type. If you go more aggressive, the diet is over quicker, and in certain individuals that may trigger a rebound, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. For some people, going hard is actually better. And yeah, with a huge deficit, you may sacrifice a bit of muscle mass, but how big of a deal is that in the long term? I mean, how much muscle are you going to lose in the first place? And do you think it'll take that long to gain it back? So the bottom line, read the article series, it's good. Then, while on the topic of deficits, what's the deal with calorie tracking? I mean, do we need to meticulously track all the time? Can we get ripped without tracking anything? Let's see the response, featuring Menno Henselmans.
Actually, Menno is probably a good example to start with. And in that podcast, we talk about how he really used it successfully to get pretty damn lean with just ad libitum dieting, so not actually tracking macros, and only had to do it right at the end, just before for that final stretch to get him really into contest shape. But he managed it for a long time. And so that as an anecdote, the important thing to consider is the level of current knowledge that Menno has, and his current level of skills in terms of seeing what he can do with his food and understanding what he's doing portion-wise. And then also he mentioned a ton of different tricks he had to make sure he was able to stay within a caloric deficit even without tracking. And so that takes some degree of knowledge, and it takes some degree of awareness, and it takes some degree of skills. What we do in our coaching practice is, at least initially, for most people, especially if they haven't tracked before, we'll get them to track for the first couple of weeks regardless. And the goal of it is that we're not seeing that they need to learn to track because that's going to how they have to eat forever. It's that during those initial few weeks where they're going to be tracking, the skills they learn and the stuff they learn about their current eating habits is stuff that will stick with them in the long term, so that when they transition to a more ad libitum style of eating, they have that knowledge and skill set to be able to apply those lessons. So for example, some people just have no clue how much they're eating, or they vastly underestimate how much they eat unless they track and actually see that number. Then it's like, oh, I didn't actually realize how much I was consuming. Or they could notice that there's certain types of foods or healthy snacks they're consuming that are actually have got a massive calorie load that they just didn't realize, and that was perhaps the reason they're doing it. Or they can start to see things of, they think their protein intake is pretty good, but when they start tracking, they actually say, oh wow, actually I'm only getting like 45 grams of protein a day, and then we know where they're really in trouble. So the stuff we learn from that, not only for their own awareness, but then how we can advise them on best to change that. Then the other thing to consider is seeing the long-term dieting approach that we want someone to have as completely distinct from a set period of actual dieting. If we see it in blocks of, okay, for this chunk of time, we're going to dedicate towards cutting, then we're going to go into a phase of maybe maintaining that weight loss or even a small bit of muscle gain, and then we'll transition back into another phase of cutting. If you're actively trying to be in a calorie deficit, it's probably going to be much more beneficial or easier if you're tracking your calories and macros. So if we do that for a period of time, then when we transition to a more maintenance phase, it's easier to go to ad libitum style of eating. we have different layers of how people can track. The first layer would be generally we have, say, a range of calories and then a range for all the macronutrients they have to fall within. Then we kind of pull that back to where they have a range of calories to fall in and then a minimum level of protein that must be above. And then we don't really care about where the fats or carbs fall on a certain day, as long as they're not actively restricting one or the other. And so it falls within like above a minimum level of protein within a certain calorie range. There's a number of different ways that someone can track using those things. That tracking can be used as a skill set. And then based on the person's preference and lifestyle, we can transition a way that they don't always need to track. And so especially if they're not actively trying to get super lean or have to diet, we can transition away from that and just look at, as long as their performance is good and body weight is good, then we're okay.
So, self-improvement time. Danny wrote a great article on the ROI, or return on investment, of your health and fitness goals. Link in the description. Amazing article. The question it examines is, what are your goals? But more importantly, what are you willing to do for that goal? And what is the point of diminishing returns?
Any decision we make always comes with a trade-off. And that's for everything in life. And the same with nutrition and training. Every decision you make, there will be some sort of upside, but there'll also be some sort of downside, because so think of any task we go and do, or anything we decide to dedicate a period of time to, by nature, that means we're taking away that time that could be dedicated towards something else. So there's always a trade-off there for what you're putting in, what you get out of it, and is that worth it to you, right? So for some people, they could be doing just a few core things and getting them right, and it gets them like 90% of the way there. And so for all the extra effort they'd have to go through to get to that extra 10% might not be worth it for the vast majority of people. Now, if you're going to be stepping on the stages and trying to be the next Mr. Olympia or whatever, then there are things that you have to do, right? Or if you're going to be trying to win gold in the Olympics, there's going to be things that a trade-off that you have to do that other people don't have to accept. And so it's just understanding what each trade-off becomes. So I also talk about I have this like a triangle of focus is what I call it. So the three main goals that most of us come across are going to be health, athletic performance, and body composition. And so at any one time, our focus is probably going to be skewed in one of those directions. So it's very rare that at, say, a specific time, that our focus is equally split between our nutrition and training being focused towards just being healthy, being focused on athletic performance, and on body composition. It may be somewhere kind of in between, but usually we have a bias in one direction. The best example we have is a bodybuilder, right? They have the extremes of muscle mass and the lowest body fat percentage. To get to that very extreme, you have to do things that are not good for your health. So bodybuilder steps on stage. That day, if you were to look at a blood panel he does, it probably doesn't look so great, right? Similarly, on that day that he steps on stage, his athletic performance probably isn't going to be good, right? If we try and get him to go and compete in the CrossFit Games, he's not exactly going to be doing too well, basically because he just feels like shit and he's not in a place to perform athletically, for example. So there's always a trade-off on our different choices. I try and steer people away from just thinking about what the outcome will be, because people oftentimes think to themselves, okay, I want this end goal, but they don't consider the process that it takes to get to that end goal. They just think, oh yeah, I really, really want it. I'll do whatever it takes. But they don't consider what does that process look like to get there, and to go through that process, what do they have to sacrifice? They also need to realize that it's okay that they don't want to do it. So for example, for me, there's certain things that I won't give up. That means that, yeah, if I was purely looking at being the ultimate super athlete or being as super ripped and lean as I possibly could, there would be other choices that I make that I don't currently do, right? I wouldn't drink beer as regularly as I do. I wouldn't be able to be as relaxed with my diet as I potentially do. I would probably have to do way more volumes of training and focus on other things and maybe pull away from other aspects of my life of like socializing, or time I spend in my business would be go more towards athletic performance. And so people just have to realize, like, where are they happy? What is the process they're happy to follow? And being okay with where that end goal is, that you don't have to be at the extremes. And people just fail to see that. They try and look at people who are fitness models, for example, and saying, oh, I really want to look like that. But then they don't consider, well, what does that person have to do to get to that point? And maybe for you, it's not worth it to get to that point. And it's okay if you don't want to. And this is probably brings up another thing of people thinking that to be healthy, there needs to be a level of perfection, where it's not the case. In that I know that when I get regular blood panels done, like I'm healthy, I feel good, I've got energy every day, so I'm in good health. But there's certain things, if I was trying to be like perfect with my diet, or trying to be like super healthy, that I wouldn't do. So I wouldn't, like, on a given weekend, I wouldn't stay out super late because I'm going to a friend's party, for example, because I know, well, if I stay past a certain time, that's going to knock out my circadian rhythms and my sleep gets disturbed and all this bad stuff happens with sleep restriction, etc., which I know is the case. But on that one-off case, the trade-off of, having poor sleep and the negative consequences of poor sleep on that one day is worth it for this social occasion I get to enjoy and memories I get to create with my friends. So there's a trade-off that I'm willing to accept at that point. Similarly, at the moment, one on a day-to-day basis that kind of reminds me good is that I have a powerlifting meet coming up in September. So it's getting to the point now where I'm squatting 3 times a week, all low bar squatting, and maybe due to my poor shoulder rotation, that I get a lot of tendonitis, particularly in my left elbow at the moment. So that can be quite sore and quite painful. And if I was looking at just being healthy and pain-free every day, then I would stop low bar squatting for a while. But based on what my goal is, I'm willing to do something that's probably not best health-wise, because I have this specific goal that I enjoy powerlifting and I want to do well in a meet, for example. And then, like I mentioned earlier, like going and having drinks with friends. Sure, if you look at research on drinking alcohol past 2 drinks, negative consequences you can get from that, sure, it's all there, and I know that. But on the flip side, I would say to people, don't discount the other things that can potentially be beneficial for your health, like the psychological effects of it being able to relax you, you enjoy things, you have a good time with friends and family. And then in that isolated instance, maybe it's actually better to be able to do that, right? So not looking at things in black and white. On that one occasion, sometimes people, by going out and saying, okay, I'm going to go for these few drinks and stay out late tonight, maybe if you look at some of the changes while it's happening, physiologically it might not be good, but overall it might actually be a good thing for the health, just for the psychological relief that it gives that person. And you can think about things with food, right? Is it good for someone to always restrict every single treat that they might enjoy and cause more psychological stress, but not being taken in anything bad or not taking in any sugar or gluten? Or is it okay for them to go and have some chocolate cake that they'll really enjoy, that they can be at maybe a party or whatever, or just on a daily basis that they really enjoy it and get some psychological satisfaction? So again, they're just all trade-offs, and just knowing when to pick them and what suits you and your kind of your time. If someone's just coming in that generally wants to just be healthy, be relatively strong, be in decent health, and doesn't have to overly stress about that stuff, then get them focusing on the kind of core things that'll work. Maybe lift some heavy things, maybe 3 times a week. Try and get some good quality sleep. Make sure your diet is pretty solid, and then that will take care of the vast majority of results that the vast majority of people need. There's a certain point of for a whole lot of extra effort, the benefit is relatively small, but for some people that relatively small difference is worth it if they have a certain bias for one of those goals, I suppose.
So closing in here, at the end of his episodes, Danny asks these highly successful people for one piece of advice that they would give for people who seek to improve in any area of their lives. I was curious what he thinks was the best piece of advice or concept that came from there.
I think the main ones that I've regularly had are probably ones that I've maybe mentioned before. Gratitude is one that I try and still maybe don't do enough, but I always try at some point, whether that's through writing it down in an actual journal, which I have, of things that I'm grateful for each day, or at least taking some point in the day where I'll just think of what I can be grateful for and what actually is going well, and how lucky I am to have the kind of circumstances that we have, and how I think most of us can see that. I think if we actually take a step back and just see how most of the world lives and see how lucky we are with what we have. So gratitude is one I try and employ. And then apart from that is actually just thinking about what things, even no matter how small they are, actually on just a day-to-day basis make me feel good and feel happy. and where can I implement them? So whether that's meeting a friend and having a coffee, something small like that, or whether it's going training and getting into the gym and talking to the guys that are training there and just getting under the bar and having that kind of a bit of interaction with them. Some simple things like that of just saying, okay, these are things I actually enjoy, so how can I actively try and include more of these? Or making time of saying, okay, who's someone that is important to me, and how do I actively in my schedule program time to go and make a call to them or to try and see them regularly with my family or whatever. And it does become, it's obviously not easy to do every day, but just at least trying to do that have been things that have made a difference for me.
So then, what habits did Danny implement in his life that have made a big difference for him in terms of success and happiness?
For me, when I try and think of ones that have like really stuck with me, one that thing that I've seen put by someone that was on the podcast was when Ryan Doris was on, and it was something to the effect of, "There's nothing I despise more than people who are obsessed with themselves, but nothing I respect more than people who are obsessed with their passion or their craft." That stuck with me because I think that's important, of trying to get away with being always obsessed with what we're doing and how we can make lives better for ourselves, and just being like this self-absorbed thing. But we shouldn't say that any obsession is bad, because that's a kind of common thing we see of people saying, oh, it's unhealthy what you're doing, you're obsessed with this certain sport or you're obsessed with this certain hobby. I think that obsession is good, right? If you really enjoy a certain sport, then become obsessed with that. If you really enjoy a certain activity you do regularly, or if you really enjoy your work and you want to make this thing that you do every single day, then it's okay to become obsessed with that. That is the way to go. Find the stuff that you're really, really passionate about and just get obsessed with it, and then completely steer away from obsession when it comes to yourself and trying to satisfy yourself. So that piece of advice kind of sticks out that Ryan said.
Finally, I stole his final line in his podcast, which is a question that, well, why don't we let him ask himself? After all, we stole his line.
And it's simply, if you could advise people to do one thing each day that would improve their life in some aspect, what would that one thing be?
One that I think has made a big difference for me, and I think that a lot of people could do, is if they start thinking of what is just the one thing that they should be focused on. So whether that's if it's an entrepreneur trying to do something with their work, or whether it's someone that has any specific goal even outside of work, whatever it is, try and narrow that down to what is the one big thing that you want to achieve. And then on a smaller scale each day, try and think of, okay, what one task that if I just did today would actually make a difference in my life and make it better in some way, or have some payoff further down the line, and then do that thing first. And then when that's done, then you can do the other things on your day. But always start with that one thing that is going to have some positive benefit on your life, or at some later stage will have some payoff and be worth it. And just get that one thing, no matter how it is, do that first. And just that done consistently over a long period of time is what leads to good things. So that's what I would say.
Awesomeness. So make that little turtle step every day towards your goals. And on that topic, I would actually recommend that you read The One Thing by Gary Keller. Great book. Anyway, that was my podcast with Danny Lennon from sigmanutrition.com. Again, if you're curious on more, then check out his website. I'll link to all of his sources in the description. And for more informational podcasts like this with cool guests, subscribe for more, because I'm promising you lots of more cool stuff is to come. All right, see you next time.